Welcome to another episode of the 3-Minute Therapy podcast. And a 3-Minute Therapy is based on the title of my book, 3-Minute Therapy, which is a presentation of REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, which these podcasts with Kevin and myself are based on. And Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy is a type of therapy, the forerunner to cognitive behavior therapy, founded by Albert Ellis in the 1950s, a genius in the field who's written over 80 books. And REBT is based on the premise that our emotions and behaviors don't come from situations themselves. Rather, it's our thinking, what we tell ourselves, the ideas in our head that cause our emotions, not situations. That's a very powerful idea, because if it's your thinking and you don't like your emotions, you have disturbed emotions such as depression, anxiety, and anger, then you can change your feelings by changing your thinking. And I'm a clinical psychologist. As I mentioned, I've written 3-Minute Therapy and a few other books. And I have this podcast, 3-Minute Therapy podcast, with my partner, my REBT partner here, Kevin, who also is an excellent REBT therapist in private practice. Anything else you'd like me to add about yourself, Kevin?
No, that's basically it. I'm in private practice. I'm located in Yuma, Arizona. My website is www.cogyuma.com, and I'm in private practice. I see everybody virtually. It's all online through either two-way secure telehealth communication, audio visual, or just audio. So that's what I do.
And your website is cogyuma.com?
Right. C-O-G, Yuma, Y-U-M-A.com.
Right. Okay, very good. And today we'll be discussing an REBT approach to depression. So I'll start by reinforcing the basic REBT notion is that if you're depressed, whether you're episodically depressed or been depressed for all your life, sometimes that's called clinical depression, then the essential characteristic in there that is most accessible to change is your thinking. It's your depressed thinking that causes your depressed emotions, your depression. And depressed thinking comes in a few categories, but the two main ones for depression is a demand on oneself. Because I prefer to do well and get approval, therefore I absolutely must. I have to do well and get your approval. And if I don't, I'm no good, I'm a loser, I'm unlovable. And the other category of depressions is not in terms of oneself, but it's in terms of the situations in life we find ourselves in. And that takes a form of, because I prefer my life be fair, easy, and hassle-free. It absolutely must, it has to be. And if it's not, then I'll be miserable forever. I might as well lie down and bury myself, or escape in addictions, or by procrastinating and putting off difficult things in my life. So those are the main premises with addictions. Did you want to add anything to that, Kevin?
Yeah, what I wanted to throw out there is quite often these are quite often the demands we make, the shoulds and the musts, really reflect our healthy desires, but we just we jack them up, so to speak, into being demands. It's perfectly reasonable for me to want to have a good job, be able to meet my expenses, and not have hassles. But it's when I tell myself these absolutely must not happen that's when the depression, that's when we can get depressed. And one thing I know, maybe you've noticed this too, I'm sure you have, Michael, that quite often the demands are not really verbalized in the person's head until we talk to them about them. They're more like attitudes. It's just kind of a sense that something should be a certain way or has to be a certain way. And it's not until we take it apart that we can see the should, the must, the evaluation, whatever.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I find with new clients, even though they express what you did, Kevin, that they're not really aware of thinking I must or I should or life must or should not something. Once they start looking for it and inferring it, then it becomes a lot clearer to them. So sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
as Kevin's saying, this would be an inference. You infer what the must and should is. So if you're depressed because you got fired, we can infer that the must is I must not be fired. I must have a job. I should not have the hassles of getting a new job, things like that. So normally you'll find that. Albert Ellis used to say in his inimitable Bronx French accent, cherchez le should, cherchez le must. Look for your should, look for your must. And if you do, you'll normally find it. So then once you
Mm-hmm.
find it, you've diagnosed the problem. We didn't have to put you on a couch for 6 years and have you free associate about your childhood, but rather we just looked into your head, or you did, to figure out what you're telling yourself. And so that's the diagnosis. And then the solution is questioning, challenging, disputing, and contradicting your musts and shoulds. And the reason why that's works, if you do it thoroughly and meaningfully, is because you'll find no evidence in the real world. There are no empirics to reinforce musts and shoulds. You can't find them anywhere. You can look under your pillow or in your attic. You're not going to find any musts or shoulds. You're just going to find goals you have, like clean up your attic, and then preferences. I prefer to clean up my attic, and but if I don't, I don't. It has disadvantages, but not horrors, not world-ending scenarios. And that's another point about musts and shoulds. They tend to lead to global evaluations. So if you start with a must, I must clean up my attic, then it normally psychologically, not logically, but psychologically leads to these global evaluations. I haven't, so I'm no good. And this proves I'm a loser. It's hopeless. I'll never have a clean attic, those kinds of things. And there are, just as there are no musts and shoulds, there are no global evaluations. Everything has its advantages and disadvantages. So, for example, if it's cleaning up your attic, the disadvantage is your attic remains cluttered. It's harder to find things. You could trip there if you walk in the dark. But the advantages are you save some time to do something else. There are always opportunity costs. So it's your job to weigh the advantages versus the disadvantages and decide which is greater. But as long as you have the must, you're likely to escalate the disadvantages to the nth power, and that's going to outweigh the advantages. So you'll act on the disadvantages. So if you want to make a good decision in your life and you're depressed about not making it, which often leads to indecisiveness, then the issue is, again, look for your musts, look for your shoulds, and extirpate them, get rid of them, because they're just clogging up your brain and they're not going to help you improve your life. Now, it's easy enough for me to say, and it's hard to do. And this takes practice, reinforcement, review, going over all the reasons why the musts are false and reinforcing the preferences rather than just saying, I prefer to clean up my attic. I prefer to do my homework. I prefer to wash the dishes. Just verbalizing that is not going to be nearly as useful as reinforcing the deep meanings behind it, that the preferences make sense. They have advantages if you do it, disadvantages if you don't, but the musts don't. You could never turn into a bad person, a worthless person, a loser, no matter how poorly you act. And the reason for that is we're all just imperfect humans who act imperfectly. And that's called unconditional self acceptance rather than putting yourself up or down when you act imperfectly. So that's really depression, its treatment in a nutshell. From me, Kevin, do you have further additions to that?
Yeah, the the I one thing that I've noticed is that everybody that I work with, well, maybe not everybody, as there are no absolutes. Most people I work with understand the concepts pretty easily, and when I point out their demanding thinking to them, I generally see that light bulb go on in their head. And as you said earlier, Michael, it's not like they got to be in psychoanalysis or some other form of therapy for 6 or 7 years. This is often in the very first session. It's like, ding, ding, the light bulb goes on. But while everybody understands it easily, the big challenge I find with my clients is encouraging that consistent practice of identifying their shoulds and musts. I encourage them to use the depressed mood as a signal that there's something wrong in their belief systems, and to begin looking for the shoulds and the musts. And that helps. But the challenge is this is hard work. It's easy to understand, it's easy to see, but it takes hard work on the client's part. And sometimes, maybe this is me just being cynical, but maybe it's easier sometimes to just sit there and talk to a therapist that's rather passive, but this takes work on part of the client. I had a question for you though. These global negative evaluations, at times I have people seem to have a hard time identifying them. Would you say that they always occur in conjunction with the shoulds and musts, or sometimes do they not get that far to the global evaluations?
That's a good question. And the answer is um, that when you start with a should or a must, then there are derivatives of the shoulds and musts. And one is putting yourself down, another is I can't stand it, that it's this way, and another is what's called sometimes rather that's can standarditis, and another one is awfulizing. It's horrible, awful, the end
Mhm.
of the world. So some people are more in touch with their musts and shoulds, and I'd say a majority of clients I've worked with have been the case, but others are more in touch with their self-downing. So they might say, I don't notice that I think in terms of musts and shoulds, but I notice I do feel like a failure. I do feel worthless if I don't
Mhm.
do what I would prefer to do. So in that case, I help them work with that end of it.
Mhm.
Others might think I can't stand it, and they're aware of that. They're thinking, I can't stand it. I can't bear having a messy attic, but there's no reason I have to clean it. So then you'd work with, I can't
Mhm.
stand it. And if
Uh-huh.
when all those fail, what I do is I try the pragmatic approach. How does it help to upset
Mm.
yourself about your messy attic and feel depressed about it? Where does that get you? And often that's a lever to get into their working on their thinking. If they see it's not helpful, it doesn't do any good. So let's look deeper and infer implicit musts and shoulds and work on those
Mhm.
and do those experimentally. So another thing that I do in these cases, Kevin, is I say, well, let's try an experiment. You're not aware of
Mhm.
musts and shoulds, but let's do a 3-minute exercise and then practice it yourself for a week's experiment every day, where you infer a must or should as your irrational belief in the 3-minute exercise, and work on it that way. So that's another
Mhm.
approach. Albert
I
Ellis.
see.
Albert Ellis had had another approach which I don't use, and he said, "Look, if you want to be miserable, go be miserable." But so that's another approach.
Yeah, I don't see that working very well with my personality style.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
like to tell me if I'm on the right track here. I think the derivatives, the awfulizing, and such, the conditional acceptance, and the low frustration tolerance. I tend to think of those as having the musts, the shoulds and the musts are being baked into them. For example, it's hot in Yuma. Thank God it's not today, but generally speaking, we can say it's hot in Yuma, and it's awful that it's hot in Yuma. And then I think it parenthetically, therefore it must not be, or I can't stand my living conditions, therefore they must not exist. That's kind of how I tend to think of the derivatives. Is that close?
I wouldn't call that a derivative. If it's hot
Mhm.
in humor,
Mhm.
that's a fact, right?
Right.
So,
But
so then if you're
pardon.
depressed about it, and it's
Mhm.
because you're telling yourself, it must not be
Mhm.
so hot. What were you going to say, Kevin?
I was thinking about the awfulizing about it. Like it's awful that it's hot in Yuma, there, and then kind of the unspoken. There's an unspoken must there if we're just talking about the derivatives. Therefore, it must not be hot. Is
Yeah.
kind of how I've always thought
So,
about
so
it.
you're saying it's awful, it's hot in humor is the main belief,
Mhm.
and then it must not be
Mhm.
hot as a derivative. Is that your
No, no,
point?
other way around. That the awfulizing is, of course, the derivative of the must, and the awfulizing. There's kind of an implicit demand in there. It's hot in Yuma and it shouldn't be, or it's awful that it's hot, therefore it must not be hot. Is kind of the unspoken main thing that we're coming off of.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's what I'm
Mhm.
saying. Yeah.
Okay,
Right, right.
great,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
And what about behavioral type interventions? We've talked about well, you call the 3-minute rule, 5-minute rule before. How do you use those?
Well, 3-minute exercise, cognitive exercises. So it's another prong. So we have
Mhm.
cognitive and behavioral and emotive and
Mhm.
imagery ways to intervene on your irrational
Mhm.
beliefs. But so
Mhm.
you were asking about which one?
Uh, well, behavioral, I get a lot of people, and I'm sure you do too, where they get depressed and they stay in bed all day on the weekend, for example, just won't get out of bed.
Yeah,
And I'm
right.
wondering how you personally apply behavioral
Oh
interventions in
yeah,
those
yeah. I'm
scenarios.
glad you brought that up, Kevin, because that's
Mhm.
an important prong, and that is that just by questioning and disputing and contradicting your musts and shoulds often will not do the trick, because that's sort of in theory. And Kevin, you're bringing up, put it into practice and do
Mhm. Right.
things against your musts and shoulds. So
Mhm.
if you're thinking my attic must not be so cluttered, then push yourself to face the clutter and work on it.
Mhm.
Or what's more common is with phobias. For example, I work with clients who have a fear of crossing the Bay Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge, or a fear of being trapped in an elevator. So then the issue is, do it again and again and again. Behaviorally, go over the bridge again and again and again, and tell yourself, the chances of the bridge collapsing on me is highly unlikely. But even if it does, if I'll and I die, I'll be out of my pain. If I die, I die. Too bad. We're all going to die sometime. So you might as well get it over with. But, and
Mhm.
as you go back and forth over the Bay Bridge or take the elevator 20 times in a day, you see in practice that the roof doesn't cave in, nor does the bridge cave in. and things are not nearly as bad as you think. So the behavioral is a very important part. Or a more common example might be a fear of rejection. So if you have a fear of rejection, do things that will get you rejected, and see again and again and again, and see if it kills you. Albert
Mhm.
Ellis has the shame attacking exercises. Are you familiar with those, Kevin?
Oh yes, I did one recently at a training that was really embarrassing, but I lived through it.
Right. And it wasn't embarrassing. You embarrassed yourself about it.
Yes, yes. Oh, I embarrassed myself. I called a pharmacy and asked for them to find if they carried small condoms, and so that was very embarrassing. Yeah,
No,
or
no, you
rather, I
embarrassed just, it
embarrassed.
wasn't
Yeah,
embarrassing.
yeah. I felt embarrassed about it. That's for sure. But I survived. Right.
Right, right.
Mhm,
And if you do that
mhm.
20 times a day, call every pharmacy in Arizona and ask them, then that'll go a long way to get over your embarrassing yourself about it. And other common shame attacking exercises is put a leash around a banana and take your banana for a walk, or walk with an
Mhm.
umbrella and galoshes on a sunny day.
That would be almost every day. That would be almost every day here
Right,
where we live. You
right.
said, I don't know how we're doing on time, but you said something earlier I had a question about, that there are advantages and disadvantages to everything. What would be, and I have a couple of people like this on my caseload, what would be an advantage to having a potentially terminal illness?
Well, there are a number of advantages. One is, if you're not in pain, then advantage is you're not in pain, at least. There are some terminal illnesses that lead you to have pain. If you've been in pain for 3 months, you could have been in pain for 6 months or 1 year. And if you are in pain, the pain could always be worse. So, uh, no matter how bad something is, you can imagine how it could be worse. It could be
Oh, I
longer,
see.
deeper, broader, wider than it is.
Mhm. I see. So it's not so much that the illness, it's an advantage to have, say, cancer or something. It's the advantage that it could be worse. That's what you're referring to. That, okay, I got it.
That's one. It
I
could be
got it.
worse. Another one
Got it.
is, if you have cancer at the age of 50, it could have been worse. You could have gotten cancer at the age of 30. So,
Mhm.
so that's another way
Yeah.
it could be worse. Or you
Mhm.
could have cancer and heart disease at the same time. And you don't,
Yeah.
presumably. So,
Mhm.
so that's another way it could be
Yeah.
worse.
It could always be worse. And then you and I have talked about catastrophizing and that sort of thing. Uh, Tell me about legitimate catastrophes, like when I see the wreckage in the wake of Hurricane Ida, for example. Some people, I mean, is that a legitimate catastrophe?
That's a great question. And Albert Ellis, in his early formulation of REBT, used catastrophizing as off the charts, not in reality, like awfulizing and horribilizing. But then he
Mhm,
realized, yes, there could be catastrophes in the real world, just like what you
mhm,
mentioned. So he gave up
mhm.
the idea of catastrophizing as a fiction. So the fiction is awfulizing, terribilizing, and horribilizing about catastrophes. And that's what leads to emotional
Oh,
disturbance, not uh, recognizing something as a catastrophe, just meaning very,
uh,
very, very, very bad, like your city being hit by a tsunami or bombs or those
mhm.
kinds of things.
I see, because even that could be worse if I'm still alive. I could have died from it, or maybe it could have been worse. But the tsunami certainly is a catastrophe.
Right, right. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Got it. Mhm.
So there are these minor updates of REBT over the years. One is that when Albert Ellis first devised this, he called it RT, rational therapy. Then he changed it to I think the second incarnation was RBT, rational behavior therapy, and then he quickly changed that to REBT to bring in all these modalities, rational emotive behavior therapy. And what that means is we help people with reason, we help people with their emotions, and we give them emotional strategies to work on it. B is behavior. We give behavioral assignments, just as you had brought up, Kevin, and then the T is therapy. So it's a comprehensive, multimodal therapy, and the title REBT is designed to account for that.
And let me just say that I've practiced various forms of CBT and other things, and what really prompted me to settle on REBT is how quick it gets to the root and how efficient it gets to the problem, and that's really what I personally like about it.
Yes, I think that's a good way to summarize it. It gets to the root of the problem. We don't dilly-dally about your childhood and your dreams and things like that and waste your time and money, but rather we get to the root very quickly. And some people superficially view REBT as superficial because they say you don't look at the cause. What's the cause? And we do look at the cause. The cause is your irrational thinking. So we look at the cause much more quickly than other types of therapy. And they're, as you're pointing out, Kevin, they often are barking up the wrong tree anyway in looking at the cause. So we identify the cause, your irrational thinking, and then we show you how to uproot and abolish your musts and shoulds.
Yep. Agreed.
Okay, very good, very good. Thank you so much for your participation, Kevin. Kevin Benbow is a REBT therapist in Yuma, Arizona, but also does teletherapy. And I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, and I'm also an REBT therapist. And these days I'm doing remote, phone, Zoom, FaceTime, Skype, smoke signals, you name it. And if you want REBT, we'll figure out a way to do that. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed it, got something out of it, please give us a like. If you have questions or objections, put that in the comments box below. Donate to Patreon to help pay for expenses, and work on REBT and stay rational, to stay on the rational side of life.